The cold wind cut across the deck of the SS Merchant Pride like a knife. Captain Robert Henderson stood alone in the darkness, his binoculars pressed against his tired eyes. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, black and threatening. Somewhere beneath those dark waters, death was waiting. It was March 1941, and the war was going badly for Britain. Very badly. German submarines, called U-boats, were sinking Allied ships faster than anyone could count. In the last 3 months alone, over 200 vessels have been sent to the bottom of the ocean. Each ship took food, weapons, medicine, and often men down with it. Britain was an island, and islands need supplies to survive. If the U-boats kept winning, Britain would starve long before any German soldier set foot on English soil. Henderson lowered his binoculars and rubbed his burning eyes. He had not slept properly in 6 days. None of the crew had. Sleep meant death in these waters. 2 weeks ago, he had watched the SS Bristol Queen explode just 500 meters away. The ship had been there one moment, a solid mass of steel and cargo. Then came the flash, the terrible sound, and then nothing but flames and screaming men in the freezing water. Henderson's ship had been too far away to help. By the time they reached the spot, there was only debris and silence. The U-boats had changed their tactics recently, and that made everything worse. They no longer hunted alone. Now they traveled in groups, what the Germans called wolf packs. One U-boat would spot a convoy and report its position. Then 5 or 6 others would gather like wolves surrounding prey. They would attack from different directions, firing torpedoes and disappearing beneath the waves before the escort ships could respond. It was methodical, efficient, and terrifying. Below deck, young Tommy Walsh sat on his bunk, writing a letter by the dim light of a single bulb. His hand shook slightly as he wrote. Tommy was only 19 years old, fresh from a small farm in Yorkshire. He had joined the Merchant Navy 6 months ago, dreaming of adventure and travel. Nobody had told him about the fear. Nobody had explained how it felt to know that every moment might be your last. "Dear Mum," he wrote, "I hope this letter finds you well. We are somewhere in the Atlantic. I cannot tell you exactly where because of censorship rules. The weather is cold, but the seas are calm today. I am eating well, and the crew is friendly." He paused, chewing on his pencil. Everything he had written was a lie. The weather was not just cold, it was freezing. The food was terrible, and he was scared every single moment of every single day. But he could not tell his mother that. She worried enough already. Tommy thought about the statistics he had overheard the officers discussing. 1 in 4 merchant sailors never came home from the Atlantic crossing. 25%. Those were terrible odds. Worse than Russian roulette. The U-boats could see merchant ships from kilometers away, especially during the twilight hours when the sky was lighter than the sea. The dark shapes of the vessels stood out like targets at a shooting range dug up in the radio room. The wireless operator listened to the constant chatter of coded messages. Other convoys, other ships, all trying to survive. Earlier that day, they had heard a distress call from a tanker called the Ohio Star. The message had cut off suddenly, mid-sentence. Everyone knew what that meant. Another ship gone, another crew dead or dying in the cold water. Far away in London, the situation looked even worse from the Admiralty headquarters. Admiral Sir Percy Noble sat in his office, staring at a large map covered with red pins. Each pin represented a ship that had been sunk in the last month. There were so many pins that some areas of the map looked completely red, like a disease spreading across the ocean. Noble was an experienced naval officer who had served in the First World War. He had seen terrible things in his career, but nothing like this. The U-boats were winning, and Britain was running out of time. The island nation needed 40 million tons of supplies every year just to survive. Food, fuel, raw materials for weapons, everything came by ship. Already, people in Britain were on strict rationing. Meat was scarce. Sugar was precious. If the shipping losses continued, rationing would turn to starvation. The British had tried everything they could think of. They had developed better radar systems, but the U-boats often attacked at night when radar was less effective. They had increased the number of escort ships, fast vessels armed with depth charges to protect the slow merchant ships. But there were never enough escorts, and the U-boats were clever. They had also tried camouflage paint on the ships, wild patterns of stripes and geometric shapes designed to confuse the eye. The idea was called dazzle camouflage, and it had been used in the First World War. The patterns made it hard to judge a ship's speed and direction, but they did not make the ship invisible. A painted ship was still a visible ship, and visible ships got sunk. Noble picked up another report from his desk. This one showed the projected losses for the next 6 months if nothing changed. The numbers were catastrophic. Britain simply could not afford to lose ships at this rate. Something had to change, and it had to change soon. Back on the SS Merchant Pride, Captain Henderson finally went below to get some coffee. The ship's cook, an old man named Davies who had been sailing for 30 years, poured him a cup of the bitter black liquid. "How's it looking out there, Captain?" Davies asked quietly. Henderson did not answer immediately. He wrapped his cold hands around the warm cup and stared at the dark liquid inside. How could he explain what it felt like to command a ship that was essentially a floating coffin? How could he describe the tension of knowing that at any second, a torpedo might tear through the hull and send them all to the bottom? "We're still afloat," Henderson finally said. "That's all that matters." Davies nodded slowly. He understood. In these waters, in these times, survival from one day to the next was the only victory that mattered. Tomorrow they would wake up and do it all again. They would watch the horizons, listen to the radio, and pray that they would not see the white streak of a torpedo cutting through the water toward them. The war in the Atlantic was not like the war on land. There were no trenches, no front lines, no clear battles. Just endless water, constant fear, and the knowledge that beneath the surface, death prowled like a hungry wolf. And so far, the wolves were winning. Professor Peter Williams was not thinking about the war when the idea struck him. He was thinking about fish. It was a rainy April evening in Liverpool, and Williams stood in his laboratory at the university, staring at a mackerel swimming in a large glass tank. The fish moved slowly through the water, its body catching the light from the lamps above. Williams had been studying marine animals for over 20 years. Most of his colleagues thought his work was interesting but useless, especially now during wartime. What did fish matter when German bombs were falling on British cities? But Williams saw something that others missed. He saw solutions hidden in nature, patterns that had evolved over millions of years. And tonight, watching this ordinary mackerel, he finally understood something extraordinary. The fish's back was dark blue-gray, almost black in the shadowy water. But its belly was bright silver white, gleaming like polished metal. Williams had seen this pattern thousands of times before. Scientists called it counter-shading, and almost every fish in the ocean had it. But suddenly, Williams realized why. He grabbed his notebook and began writing frantically. When a shark looked up from the deep water below, trying to spot prey, what did it see? It saw the fish's light belly against the bright surface of the ocean above. The light colors blended together. The fish became nearly invisible. And when a seabird looked down from the sky, trying to spot lunch, what did it see? It saw the fish's dark back against the dark depths below. Again, the fish disappeared. Nature had solved the problem of invisibility millions of years ago. Animals that survived were animals that could hide, even in plain sight. Williams paced around his laboratory, his mind racing. The mackerel was protecting itself from predators above and below. But ships had a different problem entirely. U-boat commanders were not looking up or down. They were looking across the water, horizontally. Through their periscopes, they saw the dark shapes of ships against the lighter sky. The ships stood out like black shadows on a gray canvas. What if they reversed everything? What if they painted ships light on top and dark on the bottom? What if they used graduated shades of gray that would blend with the horizon instead of standing out against it? Williams worked through the night, covering pages with sketches and calculations. By morning, he had a complete proposal. His hands were stained with ink. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, but he had never felt more awake. This could work. This could actually work. The hard part was convincing the Navy to listen to him. Williams was not a military man. He had never served on a ship, never fired a gun, never even wore a uniform. He was a scientist who studied fish and seabirds and coral reefs. Why would the Royal Navy listen to someone like him? He sent his proposal to the Admiralty in London, along with detailed drawings and explanations of the science behind countershading. For 3 weeks, he heard nothing. He began to think his letter had been thrown away or lost. Then, on a Tuesday morning, a naval officer appeared at his laboratory door. Commander James Blackwood was 35 years old, tall and thin, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had lost his younger brother 6 months earlier when a U-boat torpedoed the destroyer HMS Acheron. Blackwood had volunteered for intelligence work after that, analyzing reports and looking for any weakness in the German submarine tactics. He was not interested in conventional solutions. Conventional solutions were not working. Professor Williams, Blackwood said, holding up the proposal, I read your letter about painting ships like fish. Most of my colleagues think you are insane. Williams felt his heart sink. Another rejection. Another closed door, but then Blackwood smiled slightly. I think you might be brilliant. Show me everything. They spent 6 hours together that day. Williams explained counter-shading using his fish tanks, showing how light and shadow worked in water. Blackwood listened carefully, asking sharp questions. He had brought statistics with him, numbers that showed how many ships were being sunk and at what times of day. The data was horrifying. Most attacks happened during twilight hours, when visibility was poor but not completely dark. The U-boats surfaced thin, using their periscopes to hunt. And in that gray light between day and night, dark ships showed up perfectly against the lighter sky. The traditional camouflage is not working, Blackwood said, showing Williams photographs of ships painted with dazzle patterns. These patterns confuse the eye, yes. They make it harder to judge speed and distance, but they do not make the ship invisible. The U-boat commander can still see the ship clearly enough to sink it. Williams nodded, because they're still thinking about camouflage the wrong way. They're trying to break up the shape, but they're not thinking about the light itself. It is not about patterns. It is about making the ship match the background light levels. Blackwood understood immediately. He had the kind of mind that could grasp new concepts quickly and see their applications. If we paint the ship lighter on top and darker on the bottom, with graduated tones in between, the ship would blend with the horizon. The periscope operator would look through his lens and see only gray water and gray sky, with no dark shadow in between. Exactly, Williams said. The ship would not be invisible in bright sunlight. Nothing can be invisible in bright light. But during dawn and dusk, during foggy conditions, during the hours when U-boats prefer to attack, the ship would be very hard to see. Blackwood stood up suddenly. We need to take this to Admiral Noble. Now, today. The meeting with Admiral Noble was intimidating. The Admiral's office was enormous, with paintings of famous naval battles on the walls. Noble himself was a stern man with gray hair and a skeptical expression. He listened to Williams's presentation without interrupting, but his face showed deep doubt. You want to paint our ships white? Noble said when Williams finished. Paint them to look like clouds? Not white, sir, Williams said, trying to keep his voice steady. Graduated shades of gray and pale blue. The exact colors would depend on the typical light conditions in the North Atlantic. And they would need to change seasonally because summer light is different from winter light. Noble shook his head. Ships painted light colors will stand out during the day. They will be targets for every U-boat in the Atlantic. They are already targets, Blackwood interrupted quietly. We are losing the Battle of the Atlantic, sir. We are losing badly. Professor Williams is offering us something new, something the Germans will not expect. At the very least, it deserves a test. There was a long silence. Noble looked at the map on his wall, covered with red pins marking sunken ships. He looked at the reports on his desk, pages full of casualty numbers and loss statistics. Finally, he looked back at Williams. One ship, Noble said. I will give you one ship to test this theory. One ship only. If it works, we will discuss expanding the program. If it fails, Professor Williams, you will return to your fish and never waste the Navy's time again. Understood. Williams nodded, not trusting himself to speak. One ship, one chance. It would have to be enough. HMS Lancelot sat in the harbor at Scapa Flow, Scotland, looking like no warship had ever looked before. The crew stood on the dock, staring at their vessel with expressions of disbelief and embarrassment. Their ship, a small corvette escort that had once been painted standard naval gray, now looked like it belonged in a child's painting. The upper structures were pale gray, almost white. The superstructure showed graduated shades that got darker as they moved down toward the waterline. The hull itself was painted in bands of color that shifted from medium gray at the water's edge to charcoal gray below. It looked ridiculous. It looked like someone had started painting and then given up halfway through. "We look like a bloody wedding cake," muttered Chief Petty Officer Richards, shaking his head. "The lads on the other ships are going to laugh us out of the fleet." And they did. From the moment the painting was finished, HMS Lancelot became the joke of the naval base. Other crews called them the Ghost and Williams's Folly. Someone painted a sign that said, "Invisible ship, please don't bump into us," and hung it on the dock near where Lancelot was moored. The crew of Lancelot tried to ignore the mockery, but it stung. Captain David Morrison was a practical man who had commanded escort ships for 2 years. He had sunk one U-boat and damaged 2 others. He understood the sea and he understood combat. What he did not understand was why anyone thought painting his ship like a carnival attraction would help win the war, but orders were orders. Professor Williams and Commander Blackwood were coming aboard for the trials, and Morrison would conduct the test professionally, no matter how foolish he thought they were. Williams arrived carrying notebooks and measuring equipment. He seemed nervous, constantly adjusting his glasses and checking his calculations. Blackwood was calmer, but his jaw was tight. Both men knew that everything depended on the next few days. If the test failed, the idea would be abandoned forever. Thousands of sailors would continue dying in the Atlantic, and there would be nothing Williams could do about it. The first test was simple. HMS Lancelot would position itself at various distances from an observation ship, while officers with binoculars tried to spot it. They would test different times of day, different weather conditions, different angles. The observation ship would also have a submarine periscope simulator, allowing them to see what a U-boat commander would see. The trials began at dawn. The North Atlantic sky was gray and overcast, typical weather for May in Scotland. Morrison took his ship out to sea, followed by the observation vessel. They started at a distance of 3,000 meters, roughly 2 miles. "Can you see us?" Morrison radioed to the observation ship. "Yes, clearly visible," came the response. Williams made notes. This was expected. 3,000 meters was too far for the camouflage to work effectively. They moved closer to 2,000 meters. Then 1,500 meters to 1,000 meters. Something strange began to happen. "You are becoming difficult to see," the observation ship reported. "The outline is unclear. You are blending with the horizon." Williams grabbed his binoculars and looked back at the observation ship. From Lancelot's deck, he could see the other vessel clearly. But he knew that Lancelot would look different from the other direction. The pale upper structures would blend with the gray sky. The darker hull would blend with the dark water. The graduated middle tones would create a smooth transition instead of a hard edge. "Take us to 500 meters, Morrison ordered, his skepticism beginning to fade. At 500 meters, the results were dramatic. Through the periscope simulator, Lancelot was barely visible. The ship's outline seemed to dissolve into the background. An officer watching through the periscope had to be told exactly where to look before he could spot the vessel. "My God," Blackwood whispered. "It actually works." But the real test came during the evening trials. As the sun began to set, creating the twilight conditions when U-boats prefer to attack, HMS Lancelot performed a series of approaches. The observation ship's officers, all experienced men who had spent years watching for enemy vessels, struggled to spot the approaching corvette. At T1 point, Morrison brought Lancelot to within 400 meters of the observation ship before anyone saw them. 400 meters. That was point-blank range in naval terms. A U-boat captain who could not see an escort ship until it was that close would have no time to dive, no time to escape the depth charges. The crew of Lancelot stopped feeling embarrassed about their strange paint. They began to realize that their ship had become something unique, something dangerous to U-boats in a completely new way. But Williams was not satisfied. Over the next 3 days, he noticed problems with the design. In bright midday sunlight, the light colors reflected too much glare, making the ship more visible than a standard gray vessel. The paint scheme worked beautifully during dawn, dusk, and overcast conditions, but it had weaknesses in other situations. Williams spent 3 sleepless nights working on modifications. He adjusted the paint colors, making them slightly darker. He added subtle patterns to certain areas, breaking up large expanses of solid color. Most importantly, he realized that the paint colors would need to change with the seasons. The light in summer was different from winter light. The Atlantic in January looked different from the Atlantic in July. Commander Blackwood watched Williams' work with growing admiration. The professor was not a sailor, but he approached the problem with the dedication of someone who knew lives depended on getting it right. Every calculation mattered. Every shade of gray was important. How many variations will we need? Blackwood asked. Williams looked up from his notes, exhausted but determined. At least 4 seasonal variations. Different schemes for different ship types, because a large cargo ship needs different camouflage than a small escort. Different schemes for different operational areas, because the Arctic has different light conditions than the Mediterranean. This is not a simple solution, Commander. This is a complex system that will need constant refinement. But it works, Blackwood said. That is what matters. It works. Word of the successful trials spread quickly through the Admiralty. Admiral Noble, still skeptical but impressed by the results, authorized 20 more ships to be painted with experimental camouflage schemes. Some would use Williams's graduated gray patterns. Others would try different approaches, including a surprising scheme using shades of pale pink that became known as Mountbatten pink after Lord Louis Mountbatten, who championed certain camouflage experiments. The race was now on to paint as many ships as possible before the U-boats sank them all. Paint factories began producing special naval camouflage colors. Training manuals were written to teach crews how to maintain the paint and touch it up after storms and combat damage. Naval architects studied Williams's designs, trying to understand the principles so they could create their own variations. But the real test would not happen in calm Scottish waters with friendly observers. The real test would happen in the killing grounds of the North Atlantic, where wolf packs of U-boats prowled the convoy routes, where one mistake meant death for hundreds of men. Captain Morrison gathered his crew on the deck of HMS Lancelot. They had been ordered to join the next convoy heading to Britain, escorting merchant ships through the most dangerous waters in the world. "We are going to see if this mad paint scheme actually saves lives," Morrison told his men. "If it works, we will be protecting those merchant sailors out there. If it fails, well, at least we will go down as the ship with the stupidest paint job in naval history." The crew laughed, but it was nervous laughter. They all knew what lay ahead. The U-boats were waiting. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Richter was a hunter who understood his prey perfectly. For 2 years, he had commanded U-573, a Type VIIC submarine that had sent 18 Allied ships to the bottom of the Atlantic. His crew called him the Wolf, and the nickname was accurate. Richter was patient, methodical, and deadly. On a clear September evening in 1941, U-573 was prowling the convoy routes west of Ireland. The hydrophone operator, a young man named Fisher, picked up the sound of propellers in the distance. Multiple ships moving slowly. A convoy, Richter smiled. Convoys were the best targets. Many ships close together, usually with only 2 or 3 escorts to protect them. It was like finding a flock of sheep guarded by tired dogs. "Surface to periscope depth," Richter ordered. Slow and quiet. The submarine rose smoothly through the dark water. When they reached periscope depth, Richter pressed his eye to the lens and began scanning the horizon. The light was perfect for an attack. Not quite dark, not quite light. The time of evening when ship silhouettes stood out beautifully against the lighter sky. Fisher had reported 5 ships in the convoy, plus escort vessels. But Richter could only see 3 merchant ships through his periscope. Where were the other 2? Had they fallen behind? Had Fisher made a mistake? Richter swept the periscope in a complete circle. Nothing. Just the 3 visible ships and one escort destroyer off to the left. The missing ships were a puzzle, but not an important one. 3 ships were enough. He selected the largest target, a tanker heavy with fuel. "Flood tubes 1 and 2, Richter ordered. "Prepare to fire." His crew moved with practiced efficiency. They had done this many times before. The torpedoes were armed and ready. Richter made his final calculations, adjusting for the target's speed and distance. "Fire 1. Fire 2. The submarine shuddered slightly as the torpedoes left their tubes. Through the periscope, Richter watched the white trails cutting through the dark water toward the tanker. It would take about 90 seconds for the torpedoes to reach their target. He began counting silently. 87 seconds. Both torpedoes struck the tanker almost simultaneously. The explosion was massive. Fuel tanks erupted in a fireball that lit up the evening sky. Richter allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 18 ships had just become 19. "Take us down to 30 meters, he ordered. "Turn to heading 270. Prepare to reload tubes." But something was wrong. Fisher, the hydrophone operator, suddenly tensed. "Captain, I am hearing propellers. Fast propellers. Very close. Something is coming toward us at high speed." Richter grabbed the periscope and spun it around. There, closing rapidly from a direction he had not expected, was an escort ship. But this was impossible. He had swept that entire area. There had been nothing there. Where had this ship come from? "Emergency dive," Richter shouted. "Oh, ahead full. Take us to 70 meters." The submarine tilted sharply as it dove. The crew grabbed whatever they could hold as the deck angled beneath their feet. But they were too late. The escort ship was already above them. Through the hull, they could hear the splash of depth charges hitting the water. "Brace for impact," someone yelled. The first depth charge exploded 50 meters away. The submarine shook violently. Lights flickered. The second charge was closer. The third was close enough to throw men off their feet. Water began spraying from a pipe that had cracked under the pressure. Emergency lights came on as the main power failed at U-573 had been attacked before, but never like this. Never from a ship that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Richter had been certain that area was clear. He had looked through the periscope. There had been nothing there. HMS Lancelot, painted in Professor Williams's camouflage scheme, had stalked the U-boat like a ghost. Captain Morrison had watched through his binoculars as U-573 surfaced. He had positioned his ship carefully, using the twilight and his ship's camouflage to approach unseen. By the time Richter spotted them, it was too late. Morrison dropped 20 depth charges in a carefully calculated pattern. He knew he had damaged the U-boat, but he could not be certain he had sunk it. U-boats were tough, and their captains were skilled at survival. What mattered was that he had driven the submarine away and saved the convoy. Deep below the surface, Richter managed to stabilize U-573. The submarine was damaged but still able to move. He took his boat down to 100 meters and crept away slowly, listening for the sounds of pursuit. After 2 hours, when he was certain the escort had not followed, he dared to surface. The damage was serious. One of the electric motors was not working properly. The radio antenna had been bent. Several hull plates had been dented by the pressure of the near-miss explosions. Worst of all, 2 of his crew were injured, one with a broken arm and another with a concussion. They made it back to their base and occupied France 3 days later. Richter filed his action report, but he found it difficult to explain what had happened. An escort ship had approached to within 400 meters without being seen. It made no sense. He had been looking through the periscope. He should have seen it. His superior officer, Corvettan Captain Hartmann, read the report with a frown. "You are saying the British have invisible ships now?" "No, sir," Richter said carefully. "Not invisible, but very difficult to see. The ship was there. I simply did not notice it until it was too late. Perhaps in the twilight, with the water conditions, the visibility was worse than I thought." But Richter knew it was not just poor visibility. Something else was happening. Something new. Over the following weeks, other U-boat commanders began reporting similar experiences. Ships that should have been easy to spot were difficult to see. Escorts that seemed to disappear against the horizon. Attacks that failed because the target ship was harder to track than expected. Admiral Karl Donitz, the commander of all German U-boats, read these reports with growing concern. His wolf packs had been devastatingly effective throughout 1941. The U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be built. Victory in the Atlantic seemed certain. But now something was changing in a meeting with his senior commanders, Donitz spread the reports across his desk. 7 different boats have reported unusual sighting difficulties in the past month. 7. These are experienced captains, not nervous boys on their first patrol. Something is different about the British ships. One of his officers suggested it might be a new type of radar that could detect surface submarines. Another thought perhaps the British had developed better lookouts or spotting techniques. But Richter, invited to the meeting because of his experience, had a different theory. "I think it is camouflage, sir," Richter said. "Not the old dazzle patterns we have seen before. Something new. Something that makes the ships blend with the horizon and the water. In twilight conditions, from periscope depth, these ships are very difficult to see." Donitz considered this carefully. Camouflage was not new. Ships have been using paint schemes for years. But effective camouflage that actually made ships harder to see rather than just confusing the eye, that would be a significant problem. "If this is true," Donitz said slowly, "then we must adjust our tactics. We must attack more in daylight, when camouflage is less effective. We must rely more on our hydrophones and less on visual sighting. And we must develop our own camouflage schemes for our U-boats." But adjusting tactics took time, and time was something the U-boats were running out of. By December 1941, over 150 Allied ships had been painted with various camouflage schemes based on Williams's designs. The painted ships were not immune to attack, but they were harder to find, harder to target, and harder to sink. The statistics began to change. In October 1941, U-boats sank 32 merchant ships. In November, 27. In December, 22. The numbers were still terrible, but they were moving in the right direction. For the first time since the war began, the Allies were losing fewer ships than the month before. Professor Peter Williams stood in the Admiralty Paint Laboratory, examining a small square of gray-blue fabric under different lights. It was March 1943, 2 years since his first meeting with Commander Blackwood. He looked older now, thinner, with more gray in his hair. The war had aged everyone, but the work continued. Williams had not stopped refining his camouflage designs. He worked with chemists to create paint that resisted saltwater corrosion. He studied weather reports from every part of the Atlantic, learning how light changed with latitude and season. He tested hundreds of color combinations, searching for the perfect balance that would make ships difficult to see without making them too light-colored for bright conditions. His laboratory had grown from one small room at Liverpool University to an entire facility dedicated to naval camouflage research. He had assistants now, young scientists who helped with the calculations and the testing. Some of them were women recruited from universities because so many men were away fighting. They were brilliant, quick learners who understood the mathematics of light and shadow. The camouflage system had evolved far beyond his original mackerel-inspired design. Now, there were 23 different approved paint schemes, each designed for specific ship types and operational areas. Arctic convoy ships used one set of colors. Ships operating near the African coast used another. The paint was no longer just about being invisible. It was about being harder to see, harder to track, harder to hit. Far away in the Atlantic, aboard the SS Merchant Pride, young Tommy Walsh was preparing for his 13th convoy crossing. He was not so young anymore. 2 years of constant danger had made him older than his 21 years. But he was alive, and many of his friends were not. The Merchant Pride had been repainted 6 months ago with one of Williams's camouflage schemes. The crew had been skeptical at first, just like every crew when they first saw the strange paint patterns. But Tommy had learned to trust the science. The ship had made 12 crossings since being repainted, and not once had they been attacked. Other ships in their convoys had been hit, ships without the camouflage, but the Merchant Pride sailed on. Captain Henderson, standing on the bridge with Tommy, was thinking similar thoughts. He had lost count of how many U-boat attacks he had survived. Too many close calls. Too many explosions lighting up the night. But the painted ships, the ones with the graduated gray patterns and the careful color schemes, they seemed to slip through the wolf packs like ghosts. Do you think the paint actually works, sir? Tommy asked. Or are we just lucky? Henderson smiled slightly. I think we're lucky, Walsh. But I think the paint makes us luckier. The U-boats can still see us if they look hard enough. But in the twilight, in the fog, in the moments when they're scanning the horizon quickly, we blend in. We become part of the background. And in war, every small advantage matters. In Scotland, HMS Lancelot was preparing to leave port again. Captain Morrison, now promoted to commander, had been given command of a small flotilla of escort ships, all painted with camouflage schemes. Lancelot had become one of the most successful U-boat hunters in the Royal Navy. Morrison credited the camouflage with allowing him to approach enemy submarines without being spotted until it was too late for them to dive. But Morrison was careful not to become overconfident. The camouflage was not magic. It was science, and science had limitations. In bright daylight, the ships were still visible. Vigilant U-boat commanders could still spot them. The paint was one tool among many in the struggle to control the Atlantic. The real success came from combining the camouflage with other innovations. Better radar systems helped locate U-boats. Code breaking helped predict where wolf packs would gather. More escort ships meant better protection for convoys. Long-range aircraft could now reach farther into the Atlantic, forcing U-boats to stay submerged where they were slower and less effective. All of these things together were turning the tide of the battle to be why mid-1943, the statistics told a clear story. Allied shipping losses had dropped by 60% compared to the worst months of 1941. 60% fewer ships sunk meant 60% more supplies reaching Britain. It meant food on tables, fuel for vehicles, weapons for soldiers. It meant Britain would not starve. The U-boats were still dangerous. They still sank ships, but they were no longer winning. Admiral Donitz had lost 41 U-boats in May 1943 alone, a catastrophic loss rate that forced him to temporarily withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic. The hunters had become the hunted. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Richter survived the war, though his U-boat never achieved the same success after that September night in 1941. In his later years, after Germany's defeat, Richter was interviewed by naval historians. They asked him about the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. There were many factors, Richter said, speaking slowly in his accented English. The radar, the aircraft, the code breaking. But one thing that people often forget was the camouflage. Those gray ships that disappeared into the horizon. In the critical moments, when we were hunting, when we needed to spot our target quickly, those ships were very difficult to see. We would know they were there, the hydrophones would tell us, but we could not see them clearly enough to attack effectively. It was frustrating. It was like hunting ghosts. Professor Williams never received public recognition during the war. His work was classified, kept secret, so the Germans would not fully understand what the British had done. After the war ended in 1945, he quietly returned to his teaching position at Liverpool University. He went back to studying his fish and his seabirds, back to his tanks and his notebooks. But Commander Blackwood, by then Admiral Blackwood, made sure Williams was not forgotten. In a small, private ceremony in 1946, Williams was awarded a medal for his contribution to the war effort. Only a few people attended. There were no newspapers, no photographs. Just a letter of thanks from the Prime Minister and the knowledge that his work had helped save thousands of lives. Williams kept the medal in a drawer in his laboratory. He rarely looked at it. What mattered to him was not the recognition, but the fact that the idea had worked. Nature had provided the solution, as nature so often did. Millions of years of evolution had taught fish how to hide from predators. All Williams had done was observe carefully and apply those lessons to a human problem out on quiet evenings. Williams would stand in his laboratory, watching his mackerel swim in their tanks. The same fish that had inspired everything. Dark backs, light bellies, perfectly camouflaged for their environment. He thought about all the sailors who had made it home because their ships were harder to see. all the convoys that had reached port safely, all the lives that continued because someone had taken the time to study fish. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by many people doing many things. Brave sailors who faced death every day, scientists who developed radar and sonar, code breakers who read enemy messages, pilots who flew endless patrols over gray waters, factory workers who built ships faster than they could be sunk, politicians who organized the resources, soldiers who protected the ports. But among all those contributions, among all those heroes, there was a quiet university professor who looked at a fish and saw the solution to an impossible problem. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not strength or courage. Sometimes it is simply learning to see the world differently. The convoys sailed on, painted in shades of gray that blended with the sea and sky. Invisible ships carrying visible hope. Ghost vessels that proved real enough to make the difference between victory and defeat. And in a small laboratory in Liverpool, a mackerel swam in endless circles, unaware that it had helped change the course of history.